So, one of the biggest problems that we have in our 21st century world is the uses and abuses of these things. iPhones, everything that you can look at a screen for. And as you know, Dr. Jung's oeuvre definitely pointed to Buddhism as a relatively close parallel to Jungian psychology. So I thought I would today read 3 important articles from this magazine, Lion's Roar. The subtitle of the magazine is Buddhist Wisdom for Our Time. And these all relate to the uses and abuses of iPhones, smartphones, iPads, whatever. And please understand that this is not going to be a harangue on not using your iPhone, because I believe that the more you use it, the less attractive it will be. But in our complicated day and age, it may be necessary for our children to use them only to keep up with what we are doing in the 21st century and to keep up with the necessary knowledge needed to be a functioning individual. But one of the things that I did learn when I was 40 years old was that if I turned off the radio in the car and just listened to myself while I was driving, I learned quite a lot. And at first I was almost afraid to do that. And at first I, like most of us, I think, felt that I had to have the radio on all the time when I was driving. And I was almost afraid to have silence in the car. But once I turned off the radio, I very quickly realized that I had a very powerful stream of information coming up from my unconscious. And if I only turned off the radio, I could hear myself think. And so, since a lot of the audience for this channel are young men between 25 and 40, I want to ask you whether you are one of the lost boys, as referenced by the story Peter Pan. And the question is, are you 30 years old and still living in your parents' basement playing video games? Well, maybe it's time to go out and get a life. And so, sorry to say it, but I think we all have to think about these things a little bit more. So today, as I said, I'm going to be reading 3 articles from Lion's Roar, Buddhist Wisdom for Our Time. And the overall title of this series is called Mindful Media Consumption. And it reads as follows. And what I would say also is that as long as we're not paying attention to our psyches, we will continue to be confused in our confusion. So anyway, mindful media consumption. We live in a maelstrom of media. When I first wake up in the morning, I check Twitter on my phone. At the store, pop music blares over the radio. On the elevator, a TV screen plays ads on a loop. At work, I intermittently check the news for any new leads. When I get home, I crave to plug in and watch whatever show I'm binging on at the moment. Or, if I've got the energy, read a book or a magazine. Some of this is productive, inspiring, mindful, and fun. Some of it is mindless, depressing, and wasteful. In an ever more connected world, it's important for us to be mindful of what we watch, listen to, and read. In his 5 mindfulness trainings, Thich Nhat Hanh lists mindful consumption, which is most often applied to eating and drinking. But as Sister True Dedication, a former BBC journalist, notes in her article, What do you put in your mind? When we engage in mindful consumption, we also must consider our consumption of media. As she writes, our mind is made of what we feed it. There are ways to be mindful of how we consume media as well. In How to Read the News, Holly Stocking suggests questions to ask yourself while reading the newspaper to help set a positive intention on your media consumption. And in I'm Not Okay, You're Not Okay, and That's Okay, Sylvia Borston talks about how the news can make us feel hopeless and how we can work with that. Hopefully, these 3 articles will help you find some peace in all of this madness. Now I'm going to, and that's signed, Sam Littlefair, editor, lionsroar.com. Now I'm going to read these 3 articles in a slightly different order because they struck me a little differently than they did Mr. Littlefair. But I'm convinced that we need to let our children look at social media and so on with appropriate parental controls. Obviously, there are some things out there in human life that are only appropriate for mature individuals. And if children are exposed to them too early, they really don't know how to cope with them. But once you're 30, if you're still living in your parents' basement and playing video games, you need to go out and get a life. And, I saw an interesting TED Talk a few months ago where a gentleman from India was talking about putting a laptop in a nook in Chennai and letting just poor children come to use it anytime. And he came back a couple months later to check on his laptop, and an 8-year-old kid said to him, "We need a faster modem." and so the world's youth is learning extremely fast in the 21st century. And it's not only in the United States or Western Europe, it is everywhere. And if we don't encourage our children to absorb as much as they possibly can, which is their job in the first part of life, is to learn as much as they can about being a human being, then we're going to be left behind, very simply. But there comes a time in life where we need to get a life, and Dr. Jung was very convinced that you get this life. You don't get a future one. You better live your life now. And if you're putting everything off till heaven, then you're living somebody else's life. So anyway, I'm going to go on and read these 3 articles. The first one is called I'm Not Okay, You're Not Okay, and That's Okay by Sylvia Borston. It was written May 1st, 2003. We are all subject to the pain of loss, grief, sadness, and even plain disappointment, says Sylvia Borston. But by talking to one another about it, we console. It is enough. I heard on the BBC News that a supermarket chain in Great Britain now provides chaplains in their stores, available to meet with customers when they are shopping. In Leeds, the position is shared by a Buddhist nun, a Congregationalist, and an ex-Hells Angel, now Methodist minister. There are, the report said, rabbis and imams in Jewish and Muslim neighborhoods. I did not know whether to rejoice or despair. I thought, sure, that makes sense. Everyone shops and everyone needs someone to talk to about what is meaningful. And everyone needs someone to talk to about what is meaningful to them, what touches their heart, what troubles them. But I also thought, what has become of us? Are we, as Wordsworth said, laying waste our powers by doing nothing apart from getting and spending and never leaving the shopping mall? Or have we more sadly I think there is a clue to listening in a way that makes communication meaningful. That clue, I believe, holds true in psychotherapeutic situations, in relationships with a spiritual teacher, and in mindfulness meditation. I think it is a universal clue. It works everywhere. I have a story that points to this clue. I was reading the morning newspaper on a recent trip to New York City from Philadelphia on the Metroliner Express train, and I found myself suddenly so overwhelmed by sad and frightening situations all over the world that I turned to the young woman next to me and said, "I need to take a nap now. Will you wake me in 20 minutes, please?" "Yes, of course," she said. Then she said, "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I replied. "Are you okay?" "No," she said, "I'm not." Suddenly my sleepiness was gone, and she could tell I was alert and listening. "I read the news earlier," she said, indicating the newspaper in my lap, "and I'm scared." We talked about politics, but mostly we talked about how hard it is to carry on in life as if you are fine when actually you are feeling frightened and hopeless. The more we talked, the more revived I felt. Then, as I thought the conversation was ending, she said, "I'm worried about my job, too." She had recently accepted a position she saw both as a validation of her skill level and a challenge to it. "I think I can do it, but this is a big deal, this meeting in New York. A lot could go wrong. I'm worried about not doing it well." I just listened. I didn't need to be knowledgeable about her job. I just needed to listen. I thought about how we all have concerns for the world and concerns for ourselves simultaneously. After we parted at Penn Station, I realized we'd never told each other our names. It didn't matter. By connecting, we had consoled. It was enough. The clue is, are you okay? Even our joys in their temporarily my printout of this article is a little messed up, so there's going to be a missing part. You'll have to go to Lion's Roar to get the missing part. Even our joys in their temporality remind us of impermanence. Like the French poet Villon, we lament wistfully. Where are the snows of yesteryear? We know that all the yesteryears are gone. Psychologists would also reassure us of the appropriateness of our non-okayness. Each of us carries the gifts of our Each of us carries the gifts of our heritage, our family, and our culture, as well as its wounds. It can't be otherwise. A psychologist friend of mine once said, "If you wanted it perfect, you came to the wrong planet." I am imagining this understanding, tacit or spoken, as the cornerstone of all healing relationships. Are you okay? No, not really. How about you? Not me either. But I'm okay to talk about it. It makes the journey less lonely. Let's talk. And we can talk to ourselves kindly. I tell mindfulness practitioners to listen to their tone. I tell mindfulness practitioners to listen to the tone of their inner voice. I tell mindfulness practitioners to listen to the tone their inner voice uses to comment on their experience. I ask them to consider whether, if they had a friend who spoke that way, they would keep that friend. The moment in which people discover they are not holding themselves in compassion, not speaking kindly, is often startling and always sad. That awareness is sometimes enough to cause the critic's voice to soften and the soother's voice to be heard. Okay, so that's the first article. And just Sylvia Borston is a psychologist and leading teacher of insight meditation. Her many best-selling books, including Pay Attention for Goodness Sake, and Happiness is an Inside Job. Okay, so that's Sylvia's article. And I'm reading from Lion's Roar, Buddhist Wisdom for Our Time, and I'm doing that because Dr. Jung felt that Buddhism had many useful parallels to his psychology. And obviously, in the 21st century, we all need to understand these issues about media and when we should turn off the radio. So the second article I'm going to read is What Do You Put in Your Mind? By Sister True Dedication, published July 19th, 2018. Just as you consume food, you consume media, and like food, some media is wholesome and some is unhealthy. Sister True Dedication on why you need to pay attention to what nourishes your mind. And she has this photograph of a woman going by, it looks like many TV screens, and she's a blur. And that image is by Nadia Collazo Lorenz, Comfortably Numb, 2012 to 17, courtesy of the artist and LMAK Gallery, New York. You may take care of your body with a healthy and ethical diet and perhaps a balanced program of exercise, but do you have a similarly intentional diet for your mind? We all want to master our mind, to tame its monkey mind aspects. That's why we practice meditation and mindfulness. But it's not just a question of willpower or skill. Our mind is made of what we feed it, so we need to know how to nourish and protect it. I was a young journalist working for BBC News when I first heard Thich Nhat Hanh teach that when you read a newspaper, magazine, or website, watch films or television, or even engage in conversation, you are engaged in consumption. I'd never thought of it like that before. I'd thought of TV, magazines, radio shows, and music as ephemeral and optional. It was up to the viewer, reader, or listener to do with them what they will. I heard Thich Nhat Hanh speak with a fierce and solemn voice, as he declared in a talk. When we watch television and movies, we consume. When we browse the internet, we consume. When we listen to music or a conversation, we consume. I remember his soft words booming through the loudspeakers. And what we consume every day may be highly toxic. It may contain violence, craving, fear, anger, and despair. I was shocked. Suddenly websites, radio shows, movies, music, and even conversations with close friends struck me as strangely substantive and not so ephemeral after all. Maybe I wasn't as free from them as I thought. I realized that it's true. Once those images, sounds, ideas, and feelings come into your mind, they stay there. There are disturbing scenes from movies I watched as a teenager that still come up in my consciousness 20 years later. There are conversations I walk away from feeling queasy. If I'm mindful and honest enough, I recognize how a single news bulletin can touch off seeds of fear, despair, anger, hatred, or helplessness deep in my consciousness. Or how a movie can nourish my baseline anger and aggression, or how one riff from a music track in a supermarket or escalator can speak sorrow, craving, or nostalgia just as easily as it can trigger joy and delight. I remember meeting a practitioner who wore earplugs when she did her weekly shopping, so she didn't have to hear the music. "It's my mind," she announced. "I'll choose what to put into it. Thank you very much." There's a kind of freedom. I want to read that again with different emphasis. "It's my mind," she announced. "I'll choose what to put into it. Thank you very much." There's a kind of freedom in choosing what you will let into your mind and what you won't. But how many of us allow ourselves that kind of freedom? When you stick with a TV show or news article, is it because you really want to, or is it because you're afraid to confront what comes up inside when you switch it off or put it down? In the newsroom, we were trained in the art of sticky news, the kind of news that's hard to turn off. We have more than enough information, says Thich Nhat Hanh. But is it the right kind of information? How many hours a day do we spend receiving input? What is coming into our consciousness along with it? Is it violence, fear, anxiety, craving, and despair that feed negativity, or something that helps positive seeds grow? We have to be honest with ourselves, to check in with our heart, mind, not only after we've watched, read, or listened to something, but also while we're consuming it. And again, I'm missing a small section of this. Hanh would always teach that we have to sit down and have a strategy for what we consume. We have to set an intention to talk about it and come up with a plan for ourselves as individuals, as couples, or as a family. How much media is enough and of what kind? Using a website blocking app, I've recently brought my daily news limit down from 10 minutes a day to 5, and that's plenty. It's one thing to be informed, it's another to be overwhelmed. Sometimes we're so overdosed with information that we forget the simple wonders of the present moment. The presence of our loved ones across the table, the sound of the wind in the trees, the clouds scudding across the sky, the early morning birdsong. When you eat your breakfast, are you eating your breakfast or are you eating your projects or the morning radio show? Thich Nhat Hanh would ask. If there is a lot of violence in our society, he says, it is also because as a nation, we are consuming so much violence every day in everything we watch, hear, and read. It pollutes our compassion and our peace. Advertisements are designed to trigger the seed of craving in us, to convince us that we can only be happy if when we have this or that product, to convince us that we can only be happy if and when we have this or that product. There is a whole new field of research on attention and how to steal it from us. Just traveling through a city, even if we don't want to consume, we are consuming anyway. Is it right, asked Thich Nhat Hanh, to allow people to get rich producing products that are toxic for ourselves and our children? They cannot, in the name of freedom, poison us with their products, films, magazines, books, and computer games. We speak about freedom of the press, but what about freedom of the media consumer? If we wish to cultivate healthy and compassionate minds, that freedom is something we'll have to claim for ourselves. Okay, and this about Sister True Dedication. Sister True Dedication is a monastic Dharma teacher in the Plum Village tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh and a former BBC journalist. Okay, so that's the second article. And one thing I would add is that Dr. Jung emphasized during his writing that we have to live this life. And a little later, perhaps, I'm going to read his thoughts about life after death, etc. But in any case, let me go on with this. So we're talking about how much media we should consume, and I'm reading 3 articles from Lion's Roar, which is Buddhist wisdom for our time. And the reason it's on a Carl Jung depth psychology reading group is because Dr. Jung felt that Buddhism in many ways paralleled his psychology. And by the way, this is not proselytizing for Buddhism. And I regard Buddhism as a philosophy of life, not as a religion. There are no saints, no sinners, no God, no right, no wrong. And I'll read a little bit about and no sin. I'll just read a little paragraph here about, do Buddhists believe in sin? The dictionary defines sin as a violation of religious or moral law. Since the Buddha was not God and he didn't hand down any commandments, the first part of the definition doesn't apply. You're not damned if you don't. Do what the Buddha said. You're not damned if you do or don't do what the Buddha said. More broadly, good versus evil is not the central issue in Buddhism. It's ignorance versus wisdom. Because we do not understand our own nature and the reality we inhabit, we create suffering for ourselves and others. This is the Buddha's second noble truth, that the real cause of suffering is the ignorance that solidifies ourselves and our world and creates the 3 poisons of attachment, aggression, and ignorance, in the sense of ignoring or not caring about what doesn't affect us personally. Good and evil, suffering and not suffering, if you will, is the result, not the first cause. Moral and ethical living is, of course, very important in Buddhism. It's a big part of the Fourth Noble Truth. It's the Eightfold Path to end suffering. But the ultimate antidote to suffering is wisdom. When we understand our true nature, which is open, interdependent, ever-changing, and has Buddha nature, we can relax the harmful struggle to maintain the fictitious sense of sense of self created by ignorance. That would be good. Okay, so anyway, Buddhism is a philosophy of life. It's not, strictly speaking, a religion. In this session, I'm reading from Lion's Roar, Buddhist Wisdom for Our Time, and part of this is in the online version of Lion's Roar, and I've provided links to these articles below this video. How to Read the News by Holly Stocking, July 21st, 2018. How can we follow the news in ways that nurture, not diminish, well-being? Author, Buddhist, and media scholar Holly Stocking offers some guidance. I begin to think about the harm that mindless consumption of the news can do after hearing of a spiritual teacher who cautioned his students about going to the mall. The mall can be a place where we feed our afflicted emotions, he suggested, or it can be a setting where we deepen our practice. We can mindlessly shop for items that attract us, or we can reflect on the fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying nature of ordinary pleasures and cultivate renunciation. The choice is ours. The news is not all that different. We can digest the news in ways that reinforce our suffering, or we can consume accounts of the day's events mindfully. Actively trading in ways that nurture and don't diminish well-being. One of the most important factors to determine whether an action is virtuous or non-virtuous is intention. In Buddhist ethics, which presumes effects both seen and unseen, intention is especially important. If our intention is to benefit all beings, the karmic law of cause and effect tells the results will likely be positive, whether it appears that way to us or not. Conversely, if our intention is to harm others, we can expect the results to be negative. But whether or not you subscribe to this karmic law, it can help to set a positive motivation or intention before consuming the news. Not just to be in the know or to have something to post in cyberspace, but rather, I will absorb this information with the intention of enlarging my wisdom and compassion so I can be of benefit to all I encounter. With positive intentions set, our action is more likely to ripen in positive ways. I also It also helps to apply mindfulness to... Sorry, sometimes my tongue gets confused. It also helps to apply mindfulness, to read the news slowly, observing any afflicted emotions that come up, and then bringing the mind back to love and compassion and non-attachment. Here are some questions to ask yourselves. Does anger arise? If it does, we can aspire to practice patience and compassion for the objects of our anger. I'm skipping ahead here a little because my printer, for whatever reason, has blocked out small pieces of these articles. So I've provided the links. You can go online to receive them. So there's a missed few sentences here. Then, loosening the grip of anger does not mean we have to forgo compassionate action to help those in need. It simply means we act skillfully, with an open mind and heart toward everyone involved, even those who appear to be disturbing all that we cherish. Do fear or despair arise? If they do, we can try to notice our attachments. Affection is one thing, attachment is quite another. Clutching fearful hands can also act as fists. And when we give up in despair, we have forgotten that events that appear to be life-shattering can be transformed with time into wisdom. Fear is not necessarily a bad thing. It can warn us of impending danger, but it can also propel us to do things that we later regret. Likewise, when we surrender to despair, we forget that sometimes even tiny acts can make a huge difference. Believing that there is nothing we can do, we lose our freedom to act, a form of bondage that can generate its own remorse. What about cynicism, relief, and other emotions? Of course, anger and fear and despair are not the only afflicted emotions that can arise when we consume the news. For some of us, cynicism may arise. Others may note compassion fatigue, or even guilty relief when we aren't affected by a harm that appears to have destroyed the lives of others. Still, others of us may grow secretly addicted to the news of celebrities, which can not only distract us practicing love and compassion, but also foster dissatisfaction with our less glamorous lives, or, if we look down on the celebs, a smug sense of superiority. Whatever emotions arise when we consume the news, they can become the object of mindful attention and, in time, transformation. Often these days I think of the news, like everything else, as a mirror. Our reactions to it can show us what we need to work on to tame our own tumultuous minds. Now again, there's a couple of sentences missing here. Maybe it is possible to learn to consume the news in a peaceful, calm way. We just need to practice minding the news, to train ourselves to be warriors for peace. And then this description about Holly Stocking. Holly Stocking has studied Buddhism with Tibetan Buddhist teachers since 1998. She was a journalist for the Los Angeles Times, the Minneapolis Tribune, and the Associated Press before joining the faculty at Indiana University, Bloomington, where she taught media ethics and science writing for more than 2 decades. She is the author of a chapter on Buddhist ethics for media professionals, which appears in the Handbook on Mass Media Ethics, edited by Lee Wilkins and Clifford Christians, Routledge, 2009. Her latest book with the writers of the New York Times is the New York Times Reader, Science and Technology. Okay, so I've now read the 3 articles, and I hope they've offered something to think about as we think about how we all have our faces in the iPhone. I'm as much guilty of it as anyone else. I too have walked into walls on occasion at the shopping mall. And MG says, I watched this on a mobile device. Well, I hope you've learned something then. Deborah says, good morning. Deborah says, I saw my tongue wrapped around my eye tooth and couldn't see a word I was saying. I know the feeling. Anyway, if there are any thoughts or questions you might have for me right now, I will entertain them. Otherwise, I'll move on. I have some more interesting things to read in the near future. Just on my desk, I have Aurora Consurgens, which is edited with a commentary by Marie-Louise von Franz, and it's a document attributed to Thomas Aquinas on the problem of opposites in alchemy. And so I find it quite a fascinating book, because on the left side is the Latin, and on the right side is the English. And so it's quite interesting, and it refers to visions that Thomas Aquinas was having. And there was another one that I thought would be very interesting, but now I cannot find it. Okay. Carl Jung's letter to Mary Mellon on the war. And Mary Mellon, I don't know if you see any family resemblance here, but Mary Mellon was the wife of Paul Mellon, but it so happens that she was related to the Conovers, and all the Conovers are related to one another. And so Mary Mellon was the moving force that founded the Bollingen Foundation that has published the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And I don't know if that is what got me into it, but it wasn't consciously, that's for sure. Let's see. I guess I'm not finding the other piece that I wanted to mention, but it is about death. So it's a thing you really want to hear. Yeah, I know that. Anyway, goodbye, and have a great week. I will be online tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Talking about the psychological approach to conscience. See you then.